Good morning and welcome again to Coffee with Mr. V. Today we're just going to do a very short revision video on the short run Phillips curve. So anybody to the A level or the IB, you have to do the short run Phillips curve. So I'm going to do that now. You know the score by now. If you want to participate with Coffee with Mr. V, go and grab yourself a coffee and come back to me and we're going to do the synchronized sip. All right, so 1, 2, 3. Pause me if you need to. Here we go. I love coffee. So the Phillips curve then is simply a diagram which represents the relationship between unemployment and inflation. And just to give you a bit of context, a guy called Bill Phillips, who was at the time an academic at LSE, but in his kind of life history had done a lot of a huge amount of things, and he's somebody who's definitely worth going onto Wikipedia and just seeing all the things that he did before he became this kind of economist. It was Bill Phillips who kind of developed the theory of the Phillips curve, obviously, and he was working in the 1960s. So this relationship that you see behind me is just based on the data, the UK data between 1960 and 1969. All he was basically doing was plotting unemployment statistics against inflation statistics. And as you can see, there seems to be a negative correlation. It's not linear, all right, but nevertheless, it's sloping like that. And we could call this the Phillips curve. Now, I've called it the short-run Phillips curve because some people then took the Phillips curve theory on to devise something called the long-run Phillips curve, but I'm going to do that in a separate video. The short-run Phillips curve, well, okay, this should not be much of a surprise to see that, the relationship that when unemployment goes down, inflation goes up, because we're kind of used to saying that from ADAS diagrams. And by the way, get used to coming down this way. When I say unemployment falls, we're talking about this way, but that's, in terms of macro objectives, that's a good thing. All right, we're used to working with ADAS diagrams where moving along the x-axis is always a positive move because you're seeing increases in GDP. And when there's increases in GDP, you tend to see falls in unemployment. When the demand for goods and services go up, the demand for labor goes up. But that movement to the right along the real GDP axis is the same as a movement to the left on the unemployment axis. So it's a little bit counterintuitive. And similarly, this model kind of reflects, I would hope, what you've learned about the Keynesian AS curve. And actually, that's where I want to come into this, which is when Phillips kind of came up with his idea of the Phillips curve, it kind of ended up vindicating the Keynesian model because it kind of leads to the same conclusions. That is that when we're at point A, we can increase aggregate demand to point B. Point B here. We won't get very much inflation, but we will see a growth in the economy. And similarly, we could go from point A here, very high level of unemployment, and we could reduce it to get to a lower level of unemployment, and yet we wouldn't see much inflation on the y-axis. But on the other hand, if we increase AD again, in here we talk about past the point of full capacity. If we do it here, look, inflation begins to accelerate and we start inflation starts to accelerate because unemployment has reduced to a low level. So the idea then being that there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. You can't keep on reducing unemployment forever without getting inflation. Okay, fine. The way in which kind of I think it's best to understand the Phillips curve, though, is perhaps not exactly the same story that we told ourselves about the Keynesian ADAS curve. Here we talked about how resources were very scarce, not very scarce to begin with, how they were plentiful, and therefore any increase in demand wouldn't put a lot of upwards pressure on price. But then when we get close to the curvy bit and ultimately YFE, that's where we get scarce resources, and that puts upwards pressure on the price. It is the same. It is the same principle, but I'm going to just describe it in slightly different terms. Okay, I'm going to draw a line here at point B. All right, and if you look at the shape of the Phillips curve at either side of point B, I hope you can see a difference. To the right-hand side of B here, there's a very shallow slope. Okay, we can reduce unemployment without getting huge pressure on inflation. On the other hand, once we get to the left of point B, you can see that inflation really starts to accelerate, increases at an increasing rate. So point B here is kind of like a magic place. And I'm going to call it the NRU, okay? Natural rate of unemployment, NRU, natural rate of unemployment. Some textbooks and some other economics teachers might call it the NAIRU, the NERU. Okay, that stands for non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Okay, it's not a lot of difference in what that means. Okay, but both of your specifications, both the A level and the IB, want me to call it the NRU, so I'll call it the natural rate of unemployment. What I think you ought to think about the NRU at is it's the point at which cyclical unemployment. So notice how I am now starting to use more technical terminology. Cyclical unemployment has been exhausted. That means there is no cyclical unemployment left. So let's remind ourselves what cyclical unemployment is. Cyclical unemployment is sometimes known as demand deficient unemployment. That means there simply isn't enough demand for goods and services and therefore not enough demand for labor. Right now, we're going through a demand side recession, and we've got a lot of cyclical unemployment in the UK in 2020. The idea behind this is, look, if you're cyclically unemployed, you are willing and able to work at the market wage. You're skilled, so you have the skills. You live in the right area. So this isn't other types of unemployment. And if there was enough demand, if there was an increase in demand here, you would be willing and able to work for the market wage. Okay, that's important. You would be willing to work for the market wage. You don't need anybody to offer you any more money. You're happy to work for the market wage. This is important because if average wages stay the same, then kind of average cost stays the same and average price stays the same. And if average price is staying the same, then you don't really get much upwards pressure on inflation. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. But look, we might see a slight increase in inflation, but it's really not very much. Why? Because any decreases in unemployment here up until that point is likely to be cyclical unemployment. All right, those are the people who are willing and able to work and are skilled and live in the right places, and they will accept the market wage. So if you can employ them at the market wage, I'll say it again, if your average wage stays the same as a business, then your average unit cost stays the same, and therefore your average price stays the same. So there is no upwards price pressure on inflation. At the NRU, though, you have run out of cyclical unemployment. There is nobody left in the pool, nobody left in the labour force who is willing and able to work at the market wage. So let's remind ourselves what types of unemployment we've got now. We've got structural, both occupational structural and geographic structural. So think about that. The only people left, if you're desperate as a business to employ more people because you've got more demand for output, you need to employ more people. Well, you can employ people that simply don't have the skills. But that means you've got to train them. And whilst they're training, you've also got to accept the fact that they're going to be less productive because they don't have the right skills. So there's two things there. Training costs money. Training is very expensive a lot of the time. Okay. And the other one is if productivity goes down, then your costs of production go up. So both of those things, training costs and lower productivity leading to higher cost of production, mean that your average costs are going up, meaning that your price level is going up. And that will lead to inflation accelerating. Another one then, structural geographic. Okay, the workers have the skills, but they live, 300 miles away. So what do we do about it? We're desperate to employ them. Well, the only way that you'll be able to incentivize somebody who lives 300 miles away to come and work for you is one, if you pay them above market wages, For me to go and work so far away, you'd have to pay me well above market wages, or you pay for their commuting costs. If it's a case of them hopping on a train and coming to you, you might have to bribe them essentially with commuting, or you might need to pay to relocate them, buy them a house, offer them accommodation. But all of those things, higher pay, commuting costs, accommodation costs, again, that's all driving your costs of production up. Your average cost is going up, and therefore your prices is going up, and therefore that's creating upwards pressure on inflation. Let's take another one. Maybe they're not structurally unemployed. Maybe these are economically inactive. I'll just put EI, economically inactive people. They're not willing or unable to work. Well, what's the only way that we can get those sorts of people back into work is then we would offer them above market wages. So I guess the point I'm trying to say is at any point to the right-hand side of B, and B, by the way, is I'm identifying as the natural rate of unemployment, you have a vast pool of cyclically unemployed people, people who are willing and able to work at the market wage. Once you get past that natural rate of unemployment, though, there are no cyclically unemployed people left. So the only people that you can now be employed are other types of unemployed people, but inevitably that will cause your cost of production to rise. Maybe because they lack the skills and therefore you'll have to train them. Maybe because they live miles away and you'll have to pay for them to commute every day, or you need to put them up in accommodation. Or maybe you kind of really need to bribe them because they're unwilling to work. Maybe they were retired and you want to bring them out of retirement. You're going to have to pay them above market wages. All of those things will drive up your costs, and therefore they will all drive up prices, and that is called inflation. And therefore, that is how I would explain the Phillips curve. That's how it's derived. Final few points that I want to make very quickly. As I say, the Phillips curve as it is here, okay, very much supports the Keynesian AS model, all right, because it agrees with this long run output gap idea that actually you can be down here and you can kind of reduce unemployment to a point without getting high levels of inflation. Remember, the classical economists said that didn't happen. They said whenever you increase aggregate demand, you're always going to get inflation. So this very much is a vindication of the classical model. Of the Keynesian model. Another point that I would like to make, you might see the Phillips curve drawn in all sorts of different ways in textbooks. I know, for example, other teachers are very happy to draw it like this. It's a stylistic thing, all right? Don't worry about that, okay? The fact that I draw it not cutting the x-axis and the fact that other teachers do and other textbooks do, it's not an issue. Don't worry about it. The relationship is the important thing. Whether or not inflation goes to low levels or deflation levels, it doesn't matter. That's not what you're interested in. Finally, then, one other thing is perhaps shifting up and down of the Phillips. Well, yeah, in the same way that if the AS curve shifts up and down for cost of production reasons, for example, if VAT goes up, if oil prices were to go up, if the exchange rate falls and therefore imported raw materials start costing more. So if we're going to do this with our Keynesian AS curve and shift it upwards, then yeah, it follows that we should probably also do the same thing for the Phillips curve, because ultimately, even at that natural rate of unemployment, workers will be demanding higher wages because they want the real wage to stay the same. There's no point you working for your kind of 2% pay increase per year if prices are going up by 4% each year. So all workers, regardless of the rate of unemployment, all workers will be demanding a higher rate of economic growth in their wage, a higher rate of wage growth, sorry. So that is a Phillips curve shifting upwards. And as I say, that may happen for the absolutely rational fact that workers will demand higher wages in line with inflation, in line with price levels changing. Okay, so there is our Phillips curve done in a nutshell, and I'm going to make a video in a moment about the long run Phillips curve for the IB students. Thank you very much.